Imagine a world carved from ice, where mammoths roamed frozen plains, rivers became solid glass, and the wind carried the constant challenge of survival. 40,000 years ago, Earth was shared by two human species, one whose story dominates history and one almost forgotten. The Neanderthals were not brutes. They were strong, intelligent, and built to endure the harshest conditions. They hunted giant animals, crafted tools, painted caves, buried their dead, and cared for each other with remarkable skill and empathy. Then came Homo sapiens from the south, carrying clever tools, language, and ambition. Two human worlds collided, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, reshaping the future. Yet the Neanderthals did not vanish entirely. Their DNA, their resilience, and their ingenuity survive in us. This is the story of their struggle, their survival, and the fire that never truly died, quietly burning in every human today. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. 40,000 years ago, the world was locked in a silence so deep it seemed eternal. Europe lay beneath the grip of endless winter, its mountains buried beneath glittering sheets of ice that stretched for hundreds of miles. The sky hung low and pale, heavy with snow that never seemed to end. Winds swept across the frozen plains, carving shapes into the white earth, erasing all traces of what had been there before. It was an age when life clung to the edges of existence, where every breath was a victory against the cold. In this vast, frozen expanse, mammoths trudged slowly across the tundra, their shaggy coats rippling in the wind. Woolly rhinos grazed along icy riverbanks, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The roar of cave lions echoed faintly through valleys, and herds of reindeer moved in shimmering waves, following the rhythm of the seasons that no longer felt stable. The world was brutal, magnificent, and utterly indifferent to those who tried to survive upon it. Among the creatures of this frozen earth walked two kinds of humans. One had been here for hundreds of thousands of years, molded by cold and scarcity. Their bodies were strong, their limbs thick and sturdy, their lungs deep enough to draw breath in the thin, freezing air. These were the Neanderthals, the true children of the Ice Age. The other kind were newcomers, strangers from warmer lands, carrying tools of bone and flint, words and songs never before heard in these valleys. They were our ancestors, Homo sapiens, the restless wanderers from the south. But on this first night of our story, there were no wars, no grand encounters, only the quiet struggle of survival. In a cave mouth overlooking a frozen valley, a Neanderthal family gathered around a dim fire. Sparks drifted upward like small stars, swallowed quickly by the cold. A mother pressed a fur cloak tighter around her child as the wind howled outside. The father sat, sharpening a flint blade, its edge catching the glow of the flames. Beyond the cave, the sky pulsed faintly with auroras, pale green ribbons twisting above a dead world. The Ice Age was not merely a season, it was a force that tested every living thing. For the Neanderthals, it was all they had ever known. For the newcomers still making their way north, it was a trial unlike any they had faced. Two species, bound by blood and fate, now shared the same frozen continent. The world was vast, merciless, and changing. And beneath its frozen crust, the story of humanity's oldest rivalry and deepest kinship was just beginning. They were born of ice and endurance, shaped by a world that showed no mercy. Every Neanderthal carried within them the memory of cold, the unyielding winters, the blizzards that could strip the flesh from bone, and the endless struggle to keep the fire alive. To survive here was not chance. It was mastery. Their bodies told the story of adaptation written across hundreds of thousands of years. They were shorter, broader, their bones thick as oak roots. Muscles rippled beneath layers of fur and hide, built not for beauty but for survival. Their chests were deep, lungs vast enough to drink the frozen air. Their skin, pale and roughened by wind, held the warmth of their fire-lit caves. They were not slow, nor dull. As once imagined, they were the children of the cold, and this frozen world was their home. By the flicker of flame, their eyes gleamed with intelligence. They chipped flint with skill that bordered on artistry, shaping edges sharper than any claw. They hunted mammoths with strategy, driving them into icy ravines, then waiting, patient and silent, for the right moment to strike. They could track a reindeer's hoofprint across snowfields for miles, sensing the shift in wind, the tremor of the earth beneath their feet. But it was not only muscle and instinct that kept them alive. Around their hearths, they spoke in low, rhythmic voices, a language of meaning and emotion, perhaps not so different from our own. They buried their dead, tucking flowers beside the bodies, a quiet gesture of grief or reverence. They painted with ochre on cave walls, their hands leaving red prints that still whisper from the stone. These were not beasts crouching in darkness. They were humans of a kind we have almost forgotten, capable of tenderness, memory, and awe. In the heart of one cave, a Neanderthal child pressed her small palm against the wall, leaving behind a faint red mark. Her father watched from the fire's edge, the glow painting his face in shades of amber and shadow. Outside, the wind shrieked across the cliffs, but inside, there was warmth, laughter, and the faint rhythm of life persisting against the storm. The world called them primitive, but here, in the crucible of the Ice Age, they were kings. The glaciers might move, the earth might shift, but the Neanderthals endured. They were not creatures of chance. They were crafted by necessity, by time, and by a relentless will to live. And for a long frozen age, they were the true masters of the North. The world the Neanderthals called home was a land caught between fire and ice. From the northern horizon to the edges of the ancient forests, everything shimmered with frost. The sun hung low, a weak pale light that never truly warmed the earth. The wind carried a sound that was both haunting and beautiful, whistling through valleys carved by glaciers older than memory itself. This was not a land of abundance. It was a realm of survival, and only the strongest, the cleverest, and the most enduring could call it home. Across the white plains, mammoths lumbered in silent procession, their woolly coats glistening with crystals of ice. Their tusks curved like crescents of ivory, scraping the frozen air as they searched for buried grass beneath the snow. Reindeer moved in great herds, their hooves cracking the brittle crust as they wandered south toward meager feeding grounds. Saber-toothed cats and cave lions watched from rocky ledges, patient and hungry, their eyes glowing like coals in the dim light. Every creature in this frozen theater had its place, each bound by the same law of balance: take only what the land can give, or the land will take you instead. Through the forests of birch and pine, where the snow hung heavy on the branches, the Neanderthals made their shelters. They built from bones and hides, arranging stones in careful circles to hold their fires. The scent of burning wood was life itself here, a fragile flame defying the endless cold. Fire was their constant companion, its warmth, its light, and its danger. It was both protector and destroyer, the thin line between existence and extinction. At night, when the wind quieted and the auroras danced like living spirits in the sky, the land seemed to breathe. The rivers slept beneath their crusts of ice, and the mountains stood silent as sentinels watching over the world below. In that stillness, every sound mattered: the crack of ice, the cry of a distant wolf, the soft whisper of snow falling against stone. To live here was to listen, to learn, to move with the rhythm of a world that could not be conquered, only respected. This was the earth before civilization, raw and immense, untouched by greed or industry. Life was harsh, but it was also pure. Everything had purpose, every struggle a meaning. For the Neanderthals, it was not a frozen wasteland, it was home, a place of both beauty and peril, where fire and ice danced together in eternal balance. Inside the deep mouth of a cave, the Neanderthals' world glowed with a fragile, trembling light. Fires burned low, casting long shadows that danced across walls etched with scratches and ochre stains. Every flicker revealed the shapes of their lives: a mother tending a child wrapped in fur, a father sharpening a stone blade with careful, precise movements, an elder watching over them all with quiet authority. The cave was more than shelter from the wind and snow. It was a sanctuary, a place where survival and humanity intertwined. Stone tools lay scattered across the hardened earth, each chipped edge deliberate, each form shaped with intention. Scrapers, points, and hand axes reflected a mind capable of planning and creativity. These implements were not mere instruments for killing or cutting. They were extensions of thought, of intelligence, of adaptation honed over hundreds of thousands of years. The firelight caught on polished surfaces, revealing the skill and patience of hands accustomed to precision. Every strike of flint against flint echoed the rhythm of life itself, deliberate and unyielding. Pigments of red and ochre clung to the cave walls, smudged by small palms, leaving prints like signatures across time. Perhaps these were expressions of beauty, or perhaps they were symbols, stories, or prayers. Even in the harshest cold, they sought meaning, leaving traces that would speak across millennia. These marks were not frivolous. They were evidence of minds capable of reflection, of emotion, of abstract thought. The Neanderthals were not mere survivors. They were philosophers of the frozen world, chroniclers without paper, artists without paintbrushes. Burials added another layer to their humanity. Carefully placed stones surrounded bodies laid to rest, sometimes accompanied by flowers or shells, sometimes with tools or the remains of a hunt. Death was not an end, but a continuation, a thread woven into the fabric of life. It revealed a consciousness aware of mortality, capable of grief, reverence, and perhaps even hope. Children played nearby, their laughter soft against the crackle of flames, learning the ways of survival and care through observation and imitation. Within these caves, tenderness existed alongside necessity. A father guided a child's hand, teaching the correct way to hold a spear. A mother murmured to a sick sibling, pressing warmth and breath into fragile lungs. Every action was deliberate, every gesture infused with care. It was a balance between brute survival and deep connection, a harmony that allowed them to endure the harshest of winters. The Neanderthals were often dismissed as primitive, yet these caves, their tools, their pigments, and their burials tell another story. They were thinkers, caregivers, and creators. They were human in ways we are only beginning to fully understand. In the flickering firelight, their lives were vivid, profound, and enduring, a testament to resilience, intelligence, and the quiet power of tenderness. From the warmer lands of the south, another kind of human arrived, moving cautiously yet with purpose into the frozen expanses of Europe. These were Homo sapiens, leaner and more agile than the stocky Neanderthals who had called these lands home for tens of thousands of years. Their eyes held a restless curiosity, a hunger not just for food, but for understanding and innovation. They carried with them tools delicate and precise, bone needles for stitching furs into warm garments, and points sharper than the sharpest stone. With each step northward, they brought not only survival skills, but a new rhythm of life, one that would ripple across the continent and leave traces still visible in our own DNA. Wherever they traveled, they carried language, or at least the beginnings of it. Sounds shaped into meaning, names for animals, instructions for hunting, and perhaps even stories whispered around the fire at night. Communication allowed planning across distances and time. Where Neanderthals relied largely on intuition and immediate observation, these newcomers could strategize, coordinate, and pass knowledge beyond the reach of a single lifetime. They mapped the land, not only with their eyes, but with their words, creating mental grids of movement, food, and safety. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Neanderthals watched from cave mouths and hidden valleys, observing these strange humans with long limbs and lighter frames moving through familiar hunting grounds. At first, there may have been curiosity, perhaps even admiration. These strangers could produce fire with unusual efficiency, fashion clothing that allowed for longer, colder hunts, and construct shelters from branches and hides that were portable yet protective. Yet, alongside fascination came tension. Two human worlds now existed on the same continent, overlapping in territory, diet, and instinct. The newcomers did not simply arrive. They expanded, their presence altering the patterns of the land. Herds of animals shifted in response to new hunters. Neanderthals, already surviving on a fragile balance, found themselves navigating a landscape where every step was shared, where resources were divided, and where encounters could bring cooperation or conflict. This was not conquest through force alone, it was conquest through adaptation, strategy, and persistence. And yet, for all their differences, there were moments of connection. Genetic evidence reveals intimacy, exchange, and the merging of worlds in subtle, invisible ways. The Neanderthals were not immediately replaced. They encountered, learned from, and even joined with the newcomers. Two species of humans, once separate, now entwined in the dance of survival. The Ice Age continued, indifferent to either, but within its frozen expanse, a story of coexistence, tension, and transformation quietly unfolded. It was a meeting that would change the course of evolution, leaving echoes that we carry in our very being today. The Ice Age had always been a world of extremes, but even the hardiest Neanderthals were not immune to its sudden, violent shifts. Winters grew longer, summers shorter and weaker, as the glaciers crept further south, crushing forests and grasslands beneath their endless weight. Rivers that had once teemed with fish froze solid, leaving only slivers of open water to sustain life. Herds of reindeer and mammoths, the lifeblood of Neanderthal survival, moved faster, further, chasing patches of grass hidden beneath the snow. The animals that had been predictable for generations became elusive, their migrations a cruel game against which humans could not gamble. Food, once a constant rhythm, became a treacherous puzzle. Groups that had thrived in valleys now found their hunting grounds barren. Carcasses that once nourished whole families disappeared into the distance, carried away by winds, snow, and time. Every foraging expedition became a risk, a journey with uncertain reward. Some families returned to their caves empty-handed, their fires smoldering in frustration and fear. Others did not return at all, lost to storms or the thin, icy air that burned lungs and hearts alike. The Neanderthals had endured for tens of thousands of years, but now the world seemed determined to outpace even their greatest resilience. The seasons themselves no longer offered guidance. Spring and summer arrived and disappeared in a blur of frost and thaw, confusing plants and animals alike. Crops of wild nuts and berries failed more often than they thrived, and predictable patterns of reproduction among prey were thrown into chaos. The Neanderthals relied on memory, on the rhythms their ancestors had followed, but memory could not always anticipate the new, erratic pulse of the Ice Age. Hunting strategies that had worked for generations failed to yield sustenance, leaving families exhausted, frustrated, and vulnerable. Change was an enemy more subtle and cruel than the cold. It eroded the security of caves, the familiarity of hunting grounds, and the reliability of generations-old knowledge. The Neanderthals were forced to adapt, to move further, to hunt faster, and to make decisions with less information than ever before. Every day was a test of intelligence, endurance, and cooperation. Yet the world they had mastered for so long now moved beyond them, relentless and indifferent. In the shadows of glaciers, small groups dwindled. The ice and wind claimed more than territory. They claimed confidence, stability, and certainty. Survival required not just strength but innovation, and innovation often favored the newcomers from the south, the Homo sapiens, whose lighter frames and different strategies allowed them to navigate a shifting landscape with increasing success. The Neanderthals, once the undisputed rulers of the frozen north, faced an enemy no blade or fire could fight, the unstoppable force of change itself. In this new world, even the strongest could falter, and the story of survival had become far more uncertain than ever before. By this time, the Neanderthals were living on the knife's edge of survival. Genetic studies reveal that their numbers had shrunk dramatically, leaving small, isolated groups scattered across valleys and mountain caves. The once thriving communities, connected by migration and trade, were now fractured. Each clan forced to cling to the land that still offered a fragile promise of sustenance. The Ice Age had taken more than herds and warmth. It had taken their security, their cohesion, and, in some ways, their confidence. Life became a matter of endurance, day by day, hunt by hunt, fire by fire. In the shadow of glaciers, these Neanderthals moved cautiously, leaving subtle traces in the snow for anyone who might follow or come searching. Every path was deliberate, every step measured against risk and reward. A frozen stream could provide water, but it could also hide thin ice that would trap a foot or shatter a bone. A familiar cave could protect against blizzards, but its walls might no longer conceal a predator or a rival clan. Survival demanded vigilance, intelligence, and adaptability. The light of their world, once constant and familiar, had begun to fade, and each generation felt the pressure more keenly than the last. Even the tools and techniques that had ensured their survival for tens of thousands of years were no longer guarantees. Flint points, hand axes, and bone needles could kill, cut, and sew, but they could not create abundance where food was scarce. Fires burned smaller, tended more carefully, conserving precious fuel. Hunters moved silently for hours, tracking animals that had learned to avoid humans, their patterns more erratic under the strain of shifting seasons. The Neanderthals had learned to survive ice and snow, but the world was changing faster than even the cleverest mind could anticipate. Social life endured, but in smaller circles. Children played in the protective glow of fires, learning essential skills from parents and elders, yet each loss of a family member left a deeper mark. Tribes that had once been networks of mutual aid now struggled to maintain bonds across the icy expanse. Communities faced a delicate balance. Too far from one another, and isolation could mean extinction. Too close, and competition for dwindling resources could spark conflict. Every encounter became loaded with consequence. And yet, in this fragility, there was resilience. Archaeological evidence shows that these small groups still created art, buried their dead, and tended to each other's injuries. Their culture persisted, even as numbers waned. But the dimming light of the Neanderthal world signaled an undeniable truth. Adaptation could only go so far. The forces of climate, migration, and competition were relentless, and the edge on which they teetered was razor-sharp. Survival was no longer assured, and the question loomed. How long could the children of the Ice Age endure before the glaciers claimed them entirely? The flames of the Neanderthal fires had long been their greatest ally, yet even fire could not shield them from the shifting balance of the Ice Age. Their tools, once adequate for hunting, butchering, and building shelters, now seemed rudimentary compared to the innovations brought by the newcomers from the south. Flint scrapers and hand axes could cut meat and carve wood, but they lacked the precision and versatility of the tools that Homo sapiens carried. Bone needles stitched furs into garments that allowed the newcomers to travel further and hunt longer. Projectile points and spear throwers extended their reach, letting them strike from a distance. Every advantage stacked against the Neanderthals, turning the act of survival into a contest of strategy rather than strength alone. Neanderthals could still start fires, cook meat, and light the shadows of their caves, but fire alone could not compensate for scarcity of resources. Wood for fuel became harder to find as glaciers advanced and forests retreated. Hunted animals became fewer, more unpredictable, and more difficult to corner. Their once familiar hunting grounds were now shared with Homo sapiens, who moved with planning, coordination, and sometimes persistence that the Neanderthals could not match. It was no longer a world where sheer endurance guaranteed sustenance. Ingenuity, adaptability, and long-term foresight had become survival's currency. Every encounter became a test of skill. A herd of reindeer might have been easy prey a generation earlier, but now it was often intercepted by the newcomers, who used coordinated hunting strategies, decoys, and driving techniques the Neanderthals had never mastered. Every hunt became a high-stakes gamble. A failed day could mean hunger or even death, and the pressure weighed heavily on each tribe. Within their caves, families watched fires and shadows, counting on instinct and memory, but instinct could only carry them so far. Even their shelters, built with care and knowledge of the land, could not provide absolute security. Homo sapiens constructed more portable and varied forms of protection, able to move quickly when animals or threats shifted. Neanderthals were tied to the familiar, their movements limited by what they knew and what they could carry. Fire could warm hands and hearts, but it could not expand territory, secure food, or innovate clothing. Yet they persisted. They adapted in small ways, refining techniques, trading knowledge within their shrinking groups, and nurturing the next generation to survive in a world growing colder and more unforgiving. But the firelight flickered differently now. It was no longer a symbol of dominance over the cold. It was a reminder that even brilliance can falter when the environment evolves faster than the tools and strategies meant to master it. The Ice Age had always been a test of resilience, but for the Neanderthals, it was now a race they could not afford to lose. The landscape of Europe was shifting in ways both visible and unseen. The Homo sapiens from the south moved like shadows over the icy plains, spreading steadily across the continent. Their presence was more than just bodies traversing land. It was an infusion of ideas, strategies, and innovations that began to reshape every corner of the frozen world. They carried pigments for symbolic art, crafting patterns and images on bone and stone that told stories, recorded hunts, or perhaps marked sacred events. They exchanged tools, food, and knowledge across vast distances, creating networks of cooperation that linked settlements hundreds of kilometers apart. These newcomers did not simply survive. They communicated, planned, and extended influence across the continent in ways that Neanderthals were only beginning to perceive. Neanderthals encountered these strangers in a variety of ways. At times, they watched from the edges of forests or high ridges, curious yet cautious. They saw the newcomers' leaner frames, their sharp tools, and the unusual efficiency with which they hunted and gathered. Sometimes contact was peaceful, subtle gestures of exchange or mutual observation, allowing small benefits to both groups. A Neanderthal might trade a flint scraper for an unfamiliar bone needle, or observe how the newcomers stitched furs to retain warmth. There was learning, slow and incremental, but there was also a growing awareness of difference. Other encounters turned violent. Resources were finite, and the icy world allowed little margin for sharing. Herds of mammoths, reindeer, and horses were hunted by both species, and competition could erupt into conflict. Evidence from archaeological sites shows signs of injury and tension, wounds inflicted by unfamiliar weapons, traces of skirmishes over territory, and the stark reality that coexistence was never guaranteed. Each confrontation weighed on the smaller Neanderthal populations, threatening their fragile numbers and forcing them into increasingly isolated refuges. Yet even in tension, the Neanderthals were adapting. They observed patterns of cooperation, communication, and tool use, sometimes adopting small elements of the newcomers' practices. Symbolic thinking appeared in their own art, and subtle refinements in tools suggested learning and experimentation. Still, the pressure was relentless. Every encounter, whether peaceful or violent, reminded them that the world was no longer theirs alone. By moving steadily through valleys, plains, and forests, the Homo sapiens brought more than themselves. They brought networks of exchange, social cohesion, and an intelligence applied to survival in ways the Neanderthals could not yet match. The invasion was silent in its execution, marked not by armies or conquest, but by presence, strategy, and resilience. For the Neanderthals, each day became a balancing act, a struggle to survive in a Europe that was no longer just theirs, a land now shared with a species whose ingenuity would change the course of history forever. In the quiet spaces between hunts and storms, the story of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was not only one of rivalry and survival, but also of connection. Genetic evidence tells a story that bones alone could never reveal. These two species, distinct yet remarkably compatible, met in ways that went beyond mere cohabitation of a continent. They shared the warmth of fire, the labor of hunting, and, in some instances, the intimacy of family. Their encounters were not only strategic but profoundly human, marked by curiosity, cooperation, and at times, affection. The DNA of modern humans carries traces of these encounters, a silent testament to a mingling that reshaped both species. Genes from Neanderthals survive within us, influencing immunity, skin, hair, and even aspects of our metabolism. The remnants of their presence within our bodies tell a story of unions born of proximity and necessity, of alliances formed in the shadow of ice and snow. It was not a violent erasure of identity, but rather a gradual blending, where the distinctiveness of Neanderthals began to blur into the emerging lineage of Homo sapiens. Archaeological evidence hints at these interactions as well. Tools and ornaments appear in overlapping contexts, suggesting shared knowledge or imitation. Caves, that were once exclusively Neanderthal shelters, show traces of newcomers, and in some cases, the careful layering of habitation indicates coexistence rather than conquest. Firelight illuminated not only survival but social exchange. Around these flames, children learned from both parents and visitors, imitating techniques, gestures, and language. Stories and knowledge passed from one group to another, creating a network of understanding that bridged species lines. Yet, coexistence was delicate. While some encounters were peaceful, resources remained limited, and tension lingered beneath the surface. The Neanderthals were fewer, their populations fragmented, their territories shrinking. Their survival depended on adaptation, and part of that adaptation became integration. By forming bonds, sharing bloodlines, and exchanging knowledge, they extended their influence even as their distinct cultural and genetic markers slowly faded. In this blending, there is a remarkable truth. Neanderthals did not vanish instantly or completely. Their essence persists in our DNA, in the resilience and ingenuity that defined their existence. Each flicker of fire in a cave, each careful arrangement of tools, each subtle gesture of care toward kin was a part of a legacy that continues today. Though their identity began to blur, they were not erased. They became a part of a larger story, one of connection, endurance, and survival. The shared fire between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was more than warmth. It was a bridge across species, a quiet testament to the intertwined destinies of humans and their closest cousins. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals had been driven to the edges of their former domain. Their presence in Europe was no longer widespread but confined to isolated strongholds, small enclaves clinging to the last habitable corners of the continent. In Gibraltar, along the rocky coasts of the Mediterranean, and tucked within the shadowed valleys of the Pyrenees, Neanderthals eked out survival in environments that had once been thriving hunting grounds. These refuges were not paradise. They were desperate outposts, places where every resource was precious, every hunt, a gamble against hunger and exposure. Archaeological evidence paints a stark picture of life in these final bastions. The layers of occupation reveal an increase in hunting intensity, as if every day might be the last chance to secure meat. Tools were sharpened, reused, and recycled with care, showing both ingenuity and the limits of available materials. The fires, once central to warmth, cooking, and social life, were fewer, smaller, and more controlled, conserving fuel that had become scarce. Smoke still curled into the low ceilings of caves, but it no longer symbolized abundance. It was a fragile barrier against frost and darkness. Climate shifts compounded the struggle. Winters were long and merciless, summers short and unreliable. Plants, berries, and small game became less predictable, leaving the Neanderthals dependent on the larger herds that still wandered through ice-laden plains. But even mammoths and reindeer had learned the rhythms of survival, moving farther and faster, and forcing human hunters to follow with diminishing returns. Evidence of repeated butchery and the careful transport of meat suggests that every successful kill was stretched to its maximum, feeding not just bodies but the hope of continuity. In these last strongholds, social cohesion became paramount. Small groups had to work together more closely than ever before, sharing tasks and knowledge, conserving every resource, and protecting their young. The archaeological record hints at both cooperation and stress, clustered hearths for warmth, yet signs of occasional injury and conflict, perhaps born of scarcity. Even art and symbolic practices continued, faint echoes of culture that had survived millennia, stubbornly persisting in the face of decline. Yet the signs were unmistakable. Populations dwindled, fires burned lower, and hunting, once reliable, became a gamble. These refuges were islands in a shrinking sea of ice and cold, and the Neanderthals who clung to them were confronting the inevitable. Their world, once expansive and abundant, was contracting rapidly. Every layer of soil, every fragment of bone, every smudge of pigment tells a story of endurance at the brink. The last strongholds were not just places of survival, they were the final stage of a species' struggle against a changing world, a testament to resilience and to the slow, inexorable approach of an ending that would reverberate through time. The world shifted with a sudden cruelty. Ice sheets surged southward, swallowing forests and transforming fertile valleys into frozen wastelands. Rivers that once gushed with life now lay locked under thick sheets of ice, reflecting only the pale winter Sunday. The Neanderthals, who had endured countless cycles of cold and famine, now faced a climate that moved faster than adaptation could keep pace. Archaeological layers reveal an eerie pattern. Entire regions once dotted with Neanderthal camps emptied almost overnight. Hearths went cold, tools were left behind, and caves that had echoed with life became silent. This was not a violent extinction, not a single catastrophic event, but a drawn-out unraveling. Survival had always been a matter of skill, strength, and knowledge, but even the most adept hunters could not outmaneuver glaciers or predict the erratic movements of game in a world turned hostile. The great herds that sustained life, mammoths, reindeer, horses disappeared into frozen plains or moved beyond the reach of Neanderthal hunters. Starvation became a slow companion, gnawing at populations already weakened by isolation and dwindling numbers. Evidence from skeletal remains shows signs of malnutrition, worn teeth, and bone fractures that tell of desperate hunts and injuries that went untreated. Fires burned low, often insufficient to warm the body or ward off predators. Communities fractured as individuals ventured further from the group, searching for food that might not exist. Small bands merged when they could, but the strain of overcrowding, combined with the scarcity of resources, often led to conflict, subtle yet deadly. The once cohesive social networks of Neanderthals were fraying at the edges, leaving the final generations vulnerable in every sense. The whisper of extinction was subtle, almost imperceptible to those living it. Unlike dramatic cataclysms, there was no single event to mark their disappearance. Instead, it was measured in abandoned shelters, in the gradual disappearance of tools, in the slow fading of cultural expressions, such as pigments and burials. Each empty cave, each silent valley, was a testament to a species slowly slipping from the earth. And yet, even in the face of disappearance, the Neanderthals' legacy endured. Genetic traces persisted, interwoven with the DNA of Homo sapiens, a quiet echo of a species that had once thrived across Europe and Western Asia. The Great Dying did not erase them entirely. It transformed their story, blending it into the lineage of modern humans. Their extinction came as a whisper, but it carried with it lessons of resilience, adaptation, and the delicate balance between life and environment. The world had frozen, but in that stillness, the memory of the Neanderthals would quietly endure, hidden within the genes of those who came after. The last Neanderthals clung to life along a jagged stretch of coastline, where icy waves crashed against cliffs that had stood for millennia. Their world had shrunk to this narrow fringe of land, far from the forests, plains, and valleys that had once sustained their ancestors. The sea provided sustenance, and they had learned to read its moods with the same careful observation that had guided them across frozen plains. They hunted seals with stone-tipped spears, gathering shellfish from tide pools, and scavenged whatever drifted ashore. Survival demanded precision, patience, and cooperation, for any misstep could mean starvation in the biting wind. Their firelight flickered against the walls of a small cave, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. Children huddled close to elders, learning the rhythms of the tides, the signals of approaching storms, and the ways to break open shells without losing precious meat. Every act of gathering, hunting, or tending to the fire carried an urgency that had not existed in earlier generations. Life had narrowed to necessity. Play and ritual were muted, leaving only the core of survival. The wind blew sharply across the rocks, carrying no songs, no laughter, only the memory of a world that had once been wider, warmer, and more forgiving. Every day was measured in small victories. A seal hauled from the water meant enough meat for several meals, and shellfish provided critical nutrition when larger prey was scarce. Yet, Even these small successes were tinged with fragility. Storms came without warning, and tides could sweep away nests of gathered food. The Neanderthals were masters of adaptation, but the edge of endurance had been reached. Their numbers were few, their community intimate, and every loss was deeply felt. A hunter who did not return left a void that could never be filled. The cave walls still held marks of their lives, scratches from children learning to carve, smudges of ochre from hands, tracing shapes in firelight, the faint impressions of tools left to dry by the hearth. These traces were the final echoes of a species that had walked Europe for tens of thousands of years. Outside, the coastline stretched empty and silent, a world stripped to its essentials. The roar of the Ice Age had softened into a quiet, haunting stillness, where survival was no longer a contest of strength, but of endurance, memory, and sheer will. As the days passed, the Neanderthals of this final tribe continued their routines, bound together by kinship and the instinct to endure. The world around them had grown cold and unyielding, yet within the circle of their fire, they held the last fragments of a culture, a lineage, and a story. Soon, even these last flames would fade, leaving behind a whisper of existence, carried silently in the genes and memory of those who would inherit the earth after them. Time seemed to slow along the cliffs of Gibraltar as the last Neanderthals completed their final tasks. The wind carried the salt of the sea and the chill of glaciers, brushing against weathered faces that had endured decades of struggle. The cave that had once echoed with laughter, conversation, and the crackle of fire now held only a faint warmth, the last ember flickering before surrendering to the cold. Every tool had been used for the last hunt, every piece of shellfish and meat accounted for. They knew, perhaps instinctively, that the world around them had changed beyond repair. The fire, once a constant companion, a source of warmth, light, and protection, sputtered in its final moments. Smoke curled lazily toward the cave's opening, carrying the scent of charred wood, animal fat, and human labor. It was a small, stubborn flame, clinging to life even as the last Neanderthals drifted toward the shadows. Their hands, calloused and worn, laid down stones carefully beside the hearth, marking the threshold between survival and disappearance. In the quiet, there was no sound of children laughing, no songs of the hunt, no voices calling across the ice. Only the wind whispered, brushing past the cave and sweeping across the cliffs, as if to erase the traces of a people who had walked the land for tens of thousands of years. Outside, the sea crashed relentlessly against the rocks, indifferent to the lives that had ended within the cave. The Neanderthals' existence had been measured in generations, in the careful teaching of skills, in the preservation of knowledge and memory. Now, that lineage would merge into another, leaving only fragments behind, tools, pigments, and the faint imprint of footsteps pressed into stone and mud. Ashes cooled in the hearth, tiny remnants of the warmth and light that had sustained a species, quietly waiting for millennia before humans would one day uncover them. In this final moment, the Neanderthals' story was not marked by violence or catastrophe, but by a gradual fading, a quiet slipping into history. Their extinction was not a roar but a whisper, carried on the wind, recorded in bone and stone, and preserved in the DNA that would continue within Homo sapiens. The last fire went out, and with it, the last living memory of a species that had endured ice, hunger, and the vast expanse of Europe's frozen wilderness. 40,000 years later, archaeologists would find the ashes, the stones, and the shells. They would piece together the story of resilience, ingenuity, and survival. But in that moment, the cave lay silent, the hearth cold, and the world moved forward, carrying the memory of the Neanderthals only in whispers, shadows, and the faint traces of a fire that once burned strong above the sea. The story of the Neanderthals did not end with the last flicker of fire in a cave above Gibraltar. Though their bodies disappeared from the earth, their essence quietly endured, carried in the strands of DNA that would mingle with the blood of Homo sapiens. Geneticists, peering into the double helix of modern humans, discovered a remarkable truth. Up to 2% of our genome comes from Neanderthals. These were not mere remnants, but functional pieces of biological history, woven into the very blueprint of who we are today. Their legacy was not lost. It survived, integrated, and reshaped the descendants of their once great species. Within our cells lie traces of resilience honed over hundreds of thousands of years in the unforgiving landscapes of Ice Age Europe. Certain genes inherited from Neanderthals influence our skin, hair, and immune system. They carry the memory of survival in extreme cold, of resistance to pathogens, of bodies adapted to scarcity and danger. When a modern human immune system encounters a virus or bacteria, it may carry strategies first developed by those who once walked frozen plains and hunted mammoths. In a very real sense, the battles fought by Neanderthals against the elements, disease and hunger echo within us every day. But their influence is not limited to biology. Behavioral studies hint that the traits that allowed Neanderthals to endure cooperation, social cohesion, careful observation of the environment may have shaped our own capacities for adaptation. Their lives were intimately tied to the rhythm of nature, and in the DNA they left behind, there are markers that subtly affect how our bodies respond to stress, how we metabolize food, and how we process sensory information. Every person who feels the chill of winter, every person who battles illness or adapts to hardship, carries a small echo of Neanderthal endurance. The merging of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens lineages was not always conscious or visible. It happened over generations, as the two species met, mingled, and mated in moments of proximity, necessity, or perhaps even curiosity. It was a quiet integration, leaving no grand monuments or inscriptions, only subtle footprints in our genes. And yet, it is profound. Every cell containing Neanderthal DNA is a living connection to a species that survived ice, famine, and isolation for tens of thousands of years, only to leave the world to others. Their survival in us is a testament to adaptation, endurance, and the continuity of life. While the last Neanderthal hearth went cold, their genes provided a bridge for survival in a changing world, passing down fragments of wisdom embedded in biology. In the strands of DNA we inherit, we are, in part, Neanderthal. Their story did not vanish. It transformed, flowing silently within every human heartbeat, a reminder that extinction can be physical, but legacy can endure in the most intimate and unassuming ways. In our resilience, our immunity, our very existence, the Neanderthals live on. The glaciers began to retreat, slowly at first, carving rivers from ice and exposing valleys that had been buried for tens of thousands of years. Europe's landscape transformed from endless white deserts into rivers, forests, and meadows that breathed life into the land. New species emerged, and old ones adapted or vanished. Mammoths and giant deer became rarer, replaced by smaller herbivores that could navigate the thawing terrain. Predators shifted their ranges, tracking the movement of prey, and the delicate balance of the Ice Age was replaced by a new order of survival. The world was no longer frozen, yet the memory of its harshness lingered, etched deep into the creatures that survived, and most quietly, into humanity itself. Caves that had once sheltered Neanderthals began to echo with different voices. Homo sapiens, now often referred to as Cro-Magnons in the archaeological record, moved into territories long abandoned by the previous inhabitants. They brought with them new tools, new hunting techniques, and a flourishing sense of creativity. Walls once marked by the soot of Neanderthal fires became canvases for intricate paintings filled with vivid reds, ochres, and blacks. Horses, bison, and deer leapt across cave walls, symbols of sustenance, spirituality, and observation. These images celebrated life in a world that had become far less threatening but remained awe-inspiring. Every stroke of pigment, every carefully engraved line, told the story of a species asserting itself, shaping its environment and culture in ways the Neanderthals never had the chance to. Yet, beneath this new world, the legacy of Neanderthals persisted. Their presence was subtle but powerful, encoded within the DNA of the humans now dominating the landscape. The genes that had carried resilience through ice, endurance through scarcity, and immunity against ancient pathogens did not vanish with the species. They flowed quietly through Cro-Magnon populations, shaping adaptation, strength, and survival. Every child born carried fragments of a lineage that had endured millennia of extreme cold and famine. While their faces, tools, and voices faded from the record, their influence endured in the bodies and abilities of those who came after. The past and present intertwined in unexpected ways. The lessons learned by Neanderthals' cooperation, observation, and the careful management of resources had left a subtle imprint on human behavior. Cro-Magnons may not have recognized it, but their strategies for hunting, for living in small groups, for reading landscapes, were informed by the genetic memory of a species that had walked Europe long before them. In this sense, the Ice Age did not end with the disappearance of Neanderthals. It transformed into a hidden inheritance that carried forward the wisdom of survival. As the sun rose over thawed valleys, forests, and rivers, Europe's new inhabitants celebrated abundance, creativity, and opportunity. The glaciers had melted, and the old world seemed gone. But within every cell of modern humans, the past remained alive. Neanderthals had vanished from sight, yet their essence persisted invisibly, shaping our resilience, our adaptation, and our very being. The old world may have faded, but its echoes were written into life itself, quietly reminding us that survival is not only measured in presence, but in the legacy left behind. For centuries, the world believed the Neanderthals were little more than brutish cavemen, creatures of instinct and muscle, who lived only to hunt and survive. Art, compassion, and intelligence were reserved for Homo sapiens, or so the story went. For hundreds of years, their remains were interpreted through the lens of human superiority, their thick brows and stocky bodies reduced to symbols of primitive inferiority. Museums displayed their skulls as curiosities, textbooks described them as dull and unrefined, and the imagination of the public painted them as grunting hunters of little consequence. But this narrative, repeated across generations, was a myth. It was only when modern science began to peel back the layers of time that the truth emerged. Archaeologists and geneticists, painstakingly reconstructing bones, tools, and pigments, uncovered evidence that Neanderthals were far more sophisticated than history had allowed them to be. They buried their dead, sometimes with flowers, careful placement of stones, or symbolic objects. These were not mechanical acts but gestures of remembrance, of respect, of awareness of mortality. Within these rituals lay a recognition of life's fragility, a thread of empathy woven into the fabric of their communities. The care given to the deceased reflected a mind capable of emotion, reflection, and perhaps even the beginnings of spiritual thought. Evidence also shows that Neanderthals tended to the sick and injured. Bones with healed fractures tell the story of individuals who survived significant trauma with the support of their group. A hunter with a broken leg might have lived for months, fed and protected by companions who risked their own survival to care for him. This was not a society driven solely by survival of the fittest. It was a network of empathy, cooperation, and interdependence. Their intelligence was not only in the creation of tools or mastery of fire, but in the understanding of relationships, of loyalty, and of the subtle ways a community sustains itself under extreme pressure. Neanderthals were artists as well. Pigments and ornaments have been discovered, some crafted from shells, stones, and even feathers. Patterns scratched into bones and shells suggest symbolic thought, perhaps early attempts at communication beyond practical needs. These objects were not merely decorative but expressions of identity, culture, and possibly imagination. They reveal minds capable of creativity, of play, of thinking beyond the immediate survival tasks that dominated life in Ice Age Europe. Modern genetics adds another dimension. Their DNA mingled with ours, leaving traces of resilience, immunity, and adaptation. In some ways, the Neanderthals continue to influence us, not just biologically, but through the echoes of behavior and cognition carried in our shared ancestry. They were not missing, they were misunderstood. They were not brutes, they were deeply human, capable of empathy, care, and perhaps even dreams. The myths that cast them as inferior crumble under the weight of evidence, revealing a species that was thoughtful, resourceful, and profoundly connected to each other and the world they inhabited. Neanderthals were never absent from history. They were always present, quietly shaping the course of humanity, challenging our assumptions about intelligence, creativity, and what it truly means to be human. The more we learn, the clearer it becomes that the missing kind was never missing at all. They were living, thinking, feeling beings whose legacy persists in every act of care, cooperation, and creativity that continues in our own species today. The story of Neanderthals is not only about their disappearance but also about what they left behind, quietly embedded within the very fabric of modern humans. Long after the last fire went cold in the caves of Europe, the Neanderthals continued to live on through the genetic legacy they passed to Homo sapiens. This inheritance was not superficial. It was profound, shaping who we are, how we respond to the world, and even how we survive within it. Geneticists discovered that interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was not rare or accidental. It occurred repeatedly across millennia, leaving lasting traces in the genomes of people outside Africa. These fragments of DNA, though only a small percentage of the modern human genome, carry functional significance. Some influence our immune systems, equipping us with defenses against pathogens that threatened the Neanderthals in Ice Age Europe. When our ancestors encountered new viruses and bacteria in unfamiliar lands, the immune adaptations inherited from Neanderthals gave them an edge, a survival advantage in environments that were once deadly to both species. These genes, fine-tuned over tens of thousands of years, represent a gift of resilience honed under the harshest conditions imaginable. Neanderthal contributions extend beyond immunity. Certain genes associated with skin and hair characteristics, adapted to colder climates, were passed down to modern humans. Lighter skin pigmentation, variations in hair thickness, and the ability to metabolize vitamin D more efficiently in low-light environments may all trace back to Neanderthal adaptation. These traits allowed Homo sapiens to expand across Eurasia, thriving in climates that would have been challenging for those who remained genetically closer to their African origins. In a way, the Neanderthals acted as guides, preparing our species for survival in territories shaped by ice, frost, and short-growing seasons. Even elements of communication and neurological development carry Neanderthal influence. Research on speech-related genes suggests that interbreeding may have contributed to the refinement of language abilities in modern humans. While Homo sapiens had their own capacity for expression, the merging of genetic material likely enhanced neural pathways critical for learning, social interaction, and cultural transmission. In this sense, the Neanderthals contributed to the very foundations of human cooperation and civilization, offering tools not only of survival but of communication, memory, and culture. Their legacy is a reminder that extinction does not necessarily mean erasure. Though their species vanished, their adaptations, ingenuity, and resilience continue to shape life on Earth through us. When we walk through forests, endure winter cold, resist illness, or even express ourselves through language and social bonds, we carry pieces of the Neanderthal story. Every immune response, every physical adaptation, and every nuanced behavior is a quiet testament to the survival strategies of a species that faced unimaginable challenges and left a genetic roadmap for those who followed. In this way, Neanderthals live on, not as figures of myth or legend, but as living, functional threads woven into the tapestry of modern humanity. What we took from them was not merely biological, it was survival itself, encoded in our genes and guiding our journey across continents, climates, and centuries. Their disappearance became a beginning, a hidden inheritance that continues to define us in ways we are only beginning to fully understand. When the final Neanderthal fire cooled, and the last echo of their footsteps faded from the caves and valleys of Europe, Homo sapiens stood alone. For tens of thousands of years, the continent had been shared by two humans, two ways of living, thinking, and surviving. The Neanderthals had endured glacial winters, mastered fire, hunted mammoths, and painted their symbolic world into stone. They had lived beside rivers that froze, in forests that trembled under the weight of ice, and yet their presence gradually receded, leaving a silence that Homo sapiens could not ignore. The victory of our species came at a cost that would only reveal itself much later. Being the only humans left carried an unexpected weight. Homo sapiens were free from competition, free from the need to negotiate territory, resources, or ideas with a species whose strength and ingenuity had once rivaled their own. But with that freedom came solitude. The world of human diversity had shrunk, leaving a single voice to narrate the story of life, survival, and intelligence. In the absence of the Neanderthals, the narrative of humanity became one-sided. The knowledge embedded in Neanderthal DNA, the lessons of endurance, of intimate ecological understanding, and of resilience under extreme conditions, were no longer being shared as living memory. They persisted only as faint genetic echoes and scattered artifacts. This loneliness was more than emotional. It was existential. Homo sapiens were now the only beings capable of reflecting, recording, and transmitting culture. We carried the responsibility of survival alone, not only for ourselves but for the collective memory of the human experiment. Every decision, every migration, every adaptation had to be made without the presence of a species that had thrived under conditions we were still learning to master. The absence of Neanderthals removed a mirror in which Homo sapiens could measure themselves. Their absence meant that competition became internal, ideas were only tested within our own communities, and innovation relied solely on human imagination without the tempering force of another human perspective. Paradoxically, this isolation also fueled creativity. With no other humans to compare to, Homo sapiens explored the full range of invention, art, and social complexity. Cave paintings blossomed in vivid colors. Tools became specialized and refined, and language grew richer, capable of carrying stories across generations. Yet every stroke of pigment, every crafted blade, was a whisper against the memory of a lost species. The price of being alone was the burden of being the sole custodians of humanity, tasked with preserving the threads of knowledge, emotion, and culture, without the guidance or influence of another humankind. Even today, we feel the weight of that moment. We are heirs to a planet once shared by multiple intelligent humans, and the solitude of Homo sapiens is our inheritance. We live in a world shaped by one species, carrying within us fragments of another. The triumph of being the last human comes shadowed by the memory of what was lost, reminding us that survival is inseparable from connection. To be alone is not only to endure but to carry the story forward, to speak for the silenced, to remember the fires that went out, and to honor the companions we never fully understood. The price of becoming alone was high, and it is a debt we still pay every day as the sole storytellers of humanity's vast and fragile history. As the Ice Age receded and the glaciers began their slow retreat, the world changed, and so did the humans who inhabited it. Europe, once a frozen expanse of white silence and mammoth herds, began to breathe again. Rivers thawed and forests pushed forward into valleys long buried under ice. The air carried new scents of growth, of life emerging from the grasp of cold. In this transforming landscape, Homo sapiens walked with cautious optimism, their shadows stretching across terrains once shared with Neanderthals. The world was theirs, yet it carried the echoes of another human story that would never fully fade. Survival had never been a matter of brute strength alone. It was numbers, strategy, and adaptability. Homo sapiens had thrived not by overpowering, but by expanding, by carrying within them the lessons and legacies of those who had lived before. Embedded in their DNA were traces of Neanderthals' fragments that whispered of resilience in frozen valleys, immunity against diseases born in the shadows of Ice Age caves, and adaptations that allowed life to endure in harsh climates. Every gene that shaped endurance, every instinct honed over tens of thousands of years, every creative spark for crafting tools or using fire, carried the quiet mark of Neanderthal intelligence. In this sense, they did not vanish. They merged, their essence preserved in the living, breathing descendants who now walked across a warming earth. As humans spread across this thawing world, building communities, sharing knowledge, and exploring new lands, the fire of the Neanderthals continued to burn within them. It flickered in the clever shaping of stone tools, in the careful tending of hearths, in the bonds of family and tribe, in the art of survival against the unpredictability of nature. Civilization had not yet arisen, but the foundations of culture, of cooperation, and of innovation were being laid atop the remnants of a species that had known endurance in a harsher world. The fire was not visible, yet it was potent, coursing through veins, minds, and stories that would one day become human history. Even as Homo sapiens moved forward, exploring coastlines, hunting new prey, and developing language and culture, there was an invisible inheritance guiding them. The Neanderthals' legacy was in more than biology, it was in perspective. It was a lesson in perseverance, a memory of what it meant to thrive in a world defined by extreme adversity. Theirs was the wisdom of endurance, of cooperation under pressure, of survival shaped by thought and care, not just by instinct. Every step taken by humans in the forests, mountains, and open plains carried a fragment of that legacy, a reminder that progress was built on accumulation, on connection, on remembering what had come before. The fire that once lit caves in the shadows of Ice Age Europe did not die with the last Neanderthal. It continued, flickering quietly in the descendants of two human species, merging into one. We are the inheritors of that flame, the keepers of resilience, creativity, and memory. When we light a fire, craft a tool, or care for another, we honor the endurance of those who came before. The Neanderthals are not gone. They live in our bodies, in our instincts, in the quiet strength of humanity. The Ice Age may have ended, but the fire endures, a perpetual spark of life, ingenuity, and the deep, shared story of what it means to be human. It burns still, in every heartbeat, every breath, and every act of survival we undertake, reminding us that we carry more than our own history, we carry theirs, forever entwined in the continuing story of life on Earth.